Nathan Carter had fought in countless battles, but none were as ridiculous as the one he found himself facing now. After serving in the military for over a decade, he thought his retirement in the quiet suburban town would bring peace. His home was his sanctuary, a modest house with a well-maintained lawn and a backyard that offered a quiet retreat after a lifetime of service. He'd installed solar panels to help reduce his environmental impact, a move he was particularly proud of, given his experience with energy-saving technologies during his service. The house was more than just a home. It was a symbol of his freedom, the life he'd fought for. And yet, everything he had built was about to be threatened by Karen, the self-appointed queen of the local HOA, and her merry band of overzealous board members. It started innocently enough. A knock on the door. Nathan opened it to find a notice stapled to his front door. Violation of HOA rules. Unauthorized solar panel installation. He stood there for a moment, bewildered. He'd followed all the guidelines, had permits, and even consulted with the HOA before making any changes to his property. But Karen didn't care about that. She had a vendetta against anyone who dared challenge her authority. Her rule over the neighborhood was well known. She was a petty tyrant, quick to impose fines for any and every little infraction. Whether it was the color of your mailbox, the placement of your trash cans, or, as in Nathan's case, the fact that he dared to harness solar energy, she found something to complain about. Nathan had had enough of her control. He marched to her house, his mind racing with thoughts of how to confront her without losing his cool. He knocked sharply on her door. Karen opened it with a smug smile, clearly ready for a confrontation. "Can I help you, Mr. Carter?" she asked in that condescending tone that made Nathan's blood boil. "I've just received a violation notice about my solar panels." "Care to explain?" he asked, holding up the letter. Her smile didn't waver. "You know the rules, Mr. Carter. No exterior modifications without board approval. And those solar panels? They're in clear violation of our neighborhood aesthetics." "Your aesthetics?" Nathan said, his jaw clenched. "You're more concerned about how my house looks than the planet's future?" Karen's smirk widened. "We have rules, Nathan. And rules are rules." He turned on his heel, knowing this wouldn't be the last time they'd face off. What Karen didn't realize was that Nathan Carter was not a man to be easily intimidated. She just picked a fight with the wrong person. HOA's first power moved the next morning. Nathan found a fine of $750 taped to his door. The violation? Unauthorized exterior modifications. A subtle message from Karen, no doubt. The fine was outrageous, especially considering the number of neighbors who had made far more intrusive changes to their homes without so much as a whisper from the HOA. Nathan had built the solar panels to be as unobtrusive as possible, tucked neatly onto the roof, in accordance with every guideline he could find. He took the fine in his hand, studying it. This wasn't just about the panels anymore. This was Karen's power play, her way of asserting dominance. And she knew exactly how to push his buttons. She expected him to just pay it and move on like everyone else did. But Nathan wasn't about to let her win. Karen had made a mistake. A big one. Nathan wasn't some pushover homeowner who'd simply comply with whatever Karen and her board demanded. He'd fought for far greater causes than this, and now he was ready to fight for his rights. Nathan didn't just sit back. He fired off an email to the HOA board, citing local laws and clearly explaining why the fine was unlawful. But Karen wasn't someone who took criticism lightly. By mid-afternoon, Nathan received a phone call from a local inspector. Karen had called in the heavy artillery, sending a city official to inspect his property. The inspector, a man Nathan had never met, was there to verify the violation. The inspector was polite but firm as he wandered through Nathan's yard, inspecting the solar panels like they were some sort of dangerous contraband. He scribbled on his clipboard, muttering vague comments under his breath. Nathan felt his patience start to wear thin. After a few tense moments, the inspector turned to Nathan. "Everything seems in order here," he said, clearly trying to placate him. But Nathan wasn't fooled. "You don't have to pretend, sir. I know Karen sent you." The inspector hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Carter." Nathan sighed. He wasn't about to let the HOA intimidate him through underhanded tactics. "I'm filing an official complaint about this whole process. This is harassment. If Karen wants a fight, she's got one." Nathan's words weren't idle threats. He knew the law better than most, and he wasn't going to let some petty HOA president bulldoze him. But he also knew Karen wouldn't stop here. This was just the beginning. As Nathan prepared to leave, he noticed Karen watching from her front window, her eyes following every move he made. He turned back toward her house and gave her a look that made her quickly duck out of sight. The game had begun. That night, he pored over his legal documents and researched any applicable laws that could back up his case. The more he looked, the more he realized this wasn't just about Fine, it was about Karen's need for control. He knew there was more to her reign of terror than what appeared on the surface. The following day, Nathan received yet another letter from the HOA, this time threatening legal action. Karen had crossed the line, and now, she was going to see just how far Nathan was willing to go to stand his ground. This wasn't just a fight for his property anymore. It was a fight for the integrity of the neighborhood, and Nathan was ready to go all in. The HOA escalates the conflict. Karen wasn't one to back down, not when she had the power to make people squirm. By the time the third letter arrived, Nathan knew things were about to get worse. This one wasn't just a fine. No, this time the HOA was threatening legal action. Failure to comply will result in further penalties, including the possibility of eviction and property seizure. The words were chilling, but Nathan wasn't scared. If anything, they only fueled his determination to take this fight to the next level. Karen had gone too far. She'd crossed the line from petty neighborhood politics to outright legal threats. Nathan wasn't just going to lie down and take it. He had worked too hard to get his life back on track after his military career. His home was his fortress, and no HOA president was going to come in and destroy it. So, Nathan did what any determined man would do. He started investigating. If Karen thought she could intimidate him with threats, she was sorely mistaken. He needed to understand what kind of person he was dealing with, and more importantly, what kind of power Karen really had within the HOA. He started with the HOA's financial records. Something didn't sit right with him about how quickly the fines were issued and how aggressively they were pursued. His research revealed several discrepancies. A few board members had been in the HOA for years, yet their homes were untouched by Karen's reign of terror. It seemed there was a pattern. Homeowners who challenged Karen's authority seemed to find themselves on the receiving end of massive fines, while others slipped by unscathed. Nathan reached out to a few neighbors, people who had long been disillusioned with Karen's antics, but had been too afraid to speak up. One neighbor, an elderly widow named Mrs. Brooks, told him she'd been fined for a fence she'd never even built. She had to sell part of her property to cover the costs of the fine and the lawyer fees that followed. She had no idea how Karen managed to push through such a hefty fine, but she suspected foul play. He dug deeper, contacting other members of the HOA. Most were too scared to even discuss the issue openly, but one of them, Dave, the board's treasurer, spoke to him in hushed tones. "She's been skimming off the top," Dave whispered. "She's been using the fines to fund her own little pet projects. You wouldn't believe the things she's gotten away with." Nathan's suspicion was confirmed. Karen wasn't just running a strict HOA. She was running a racket. And it was about time someone exposed her. With Dave's reluctant help, Nathan began gathering proof of Karen's shady dealings. He started to build a case that would show Karen wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was a criminal. But Karen was no fool. As Nathan's research deepened, she grew more brazen, pushing her way through the neighborhood, more aggressive than ever. She started sending inspectors around to every house, looking for any tiny infraction she could find people for. Her latest target was his neighbor, Greg, who had installed a small garden shed. According to Karen, it was an eyesore and out of code. Greg had done everything by the book. His shed was perfectly within the guidelines, but that didn't matter to Karen. She was on a mission, and no one was safe from her arbitrary rules. Nathan had to act fast. He wasn't going to let Karen destroy Greg's peace of mind, just like she hadn't been able to destroy his. But before he could take any major steps, Karen escalated things further. One afternoon, Nathan received a call from a local authority. The officer on the other end told him that Karen had filed a complaint against him, accusing him of vandalizing HOA property by installing his solar panels. The officer had already looked into it and found the claim to be baseless, but Karen had pulled the trigger. She wasn't just harassing him. She was trying to frame him for a crime he didn't commit. This wasn't just about petty rules anymore. This was personal. Nathan was beginning to realize that Karen wasn't going to stop until she had forced him out of the neighborhood, or worse, ruined him financially and legally. The more Nathan learned, the clearer it became that the HOA wasn't just a small, meddling organization. It was a corrupt, self-serving group that used its position of power to line its own pockets. Karen had manipulated the board, and they had let her get away with it for far too long. Now it was time for Nathan to take a stand. The HOA oversteps and the protagonist strikes back. Nathan had reached his breaking point. Karen's behavior had gone from ridiculous to outright dangerous. When he woke up one morning to find a crew of workers tearing up his driveway, he had had enough. They weren't there for any construction project or repairs. No, they were digging up his front yard at the behest of Karen and the HOA board, all because she claimed his solar panels were violating some obscure rule about ground aesthetics. Nathan stood frozen in the driveway, staring at the workers who were too busy with their orders to notice him at first. When they finally turned around, he didn't waste a second. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Nathan yelled, marching over to them. The workers stopped and looked at him blankly, clearly not expecting any resistance. "This is an HOA order," one of them said, holding up a work order. "We're just following instructions." Nathan snatched the paper from the man's hand, his heart pounding. The fine print stated, "In violation of HOA's aesthetic guidelines, solar panels must be removed by homeowner immediately." He crumpled the paper in his hand and stared at the workers. "Not today, boys. Not on my property." With one call, Nathan had the police on the way. When they arrived, Karen was already standing at her front window, watching from the comfort of her home, no doubt smirking at her work. The officers approached the scene and spoke briefly with the workers, but when they turned to Nathan, they were clearly on his side. "I'm afraid this is an illegal order, sir," one of the officers told the workers. "This man has a right to his property, and the HOA has no legal grounds to interfere without following proper procedures." The workers shuffled off, embarrassed and no doubt regretting their involvement. Nathan's eyes never left Karen's house. He knew this was only going to escalate. She wasn't someone who backed down easily. By the next morning, Nathan had contacted a lawyer and filed an official grievance against the HOA for illegal interference with his property. He wasn't about to let Karen's reign of terror continue any longer. This time, the HOA had made a critical mistake. They'd overstepped, and now it was his turn to fight back. The lawyer sent a strong letter to the HOA, citing multiple violations of local property laws and accusing Karen of abusing her position. Nathan didn't stop there. He also reached out to the media, telling his story to local news outlets, ensuring that Karen's actions would be exposed to the entire community. In response, Karen took the bait. At the next HOA meeting, she tried to put on a brave face as she called the officers to her defense, hoping to show that she had the upper hand. But instead of rallying support, Karen's plans backfired. Several board members began to question her decisions, including one who had been on the board for over a decade. "Karen," he said during the meeting, "maybe we've been too quick to jump on every complaint. Perhaps we should reassess how we're handling things." It was a small crack in her armor, but it was enough to give Nathan hope. He hadn't expected the board to rebel against her just yet, but this was a sign of progress. The wheels were starting to turn, and Karen's power over the HOA was beginning to slip. Karen, however, wasn't one to back down, especially when she was so close to winning. She stared coldly at the board member who had spoken up, her fingers curling into a fist. It was clear that she wasn't ready to concede. "You don't understand," Karen snapped, her voice shrill with anger. "I'm doing what's best for this community. These violations have to be dealt with, or the entire neighborhood will fall apart." But the more she argued, the more her credibility slipped. The board members weren't buying her story anymore. Several had grown tired of her constant overreach, and it was showing. They began whispering amongst themselves, casting wary glances at each other. The turning point came when Nathan stood up, his voice calm but firm. "I've done everything by the book. I've followed all the regulations, and yet here you are, trying to destroy my home and my livelihood. This isn't about rules, it's about power. And you've abused that power long enough." The room fell silent. For the first time, Karen was on the defensive. She tried to rally, to reassert her control, but her words fell flat. The room wasn't listening to her anymore. Nathan had won the first round, but he knew Karen wouldn't stop. This fight was far from over, and the real battle was only just beginning. Karen's final, desperate move. Karen wasn't one to accept defeat, especially when her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. She knew Nathan's victory at the HOA meeting had been a major blow to her ego, but she wasn't going to go down without a fight. If anything, her desperation made her more dangerous. The next morning, Nathan received an ominous letter from Karen. It was a legal notice claiming that Nathan had violated city ordinances by illegally installing his solar panels. The letter warned that unless he removed the panels immediately, he would face severe penalties, including fines and potential eviction. It was clear that Karen had decided to escalate things. This wasn't just about petty HOA rules anymore. She had crossed into legal intimidation, hoping to use the system to get her way. But Nathan wasn't intimidated. If anything, he was more determined than ever to see this through. He knew Karen's threats were empty. He had done everything by the book. Still, Karen's final move pushed him to take the gloves off. This time, it was personal. Nathan contacted his lawyer immediately, knowing this was the moment he'd been preparing for. With his lawyer's help, he gathered all the documents he needed, including city building permits, HOA correspondence, and a stack of legal precedents that would show Karen's actions for what they truly were: illegal. Karen, however, wasn't finished. She wasn't going to accept her defeat so easily. In a final act of defiance, she tried to have the electricity to Nathan's home shut off, claiming that his solar panels had violated city safety regulations and that they posed a fire hazard. Nathan was furious when he received the call from the utility company, informing him of the shutdown. It was clear now that Karen had no intention of letting up until she had completely destroyed Nathan. She wasn't just trying to win this battle, she was trying to crush him. But she had made a critical error. She had overplayed her hand. Nathan wasted no time in calling the utility company, providing them with the proof of his solar panels' compliance with all safety standards. Within an hour, the power was back on. But Karen's audacious attempt to sabotage him wasn't without consequences. The more Nathan thought about it, the more he realized that this was the moment to strike back. That afternoon, he set up a meeting with the local news station. He had already gathered a small army of supporters. Neighbors who were tired of Karen's overreach, board members who were finally starting to question her methods, and even former homeowners who had fallen victim to her tyranny. Nathan had the perfect ammunition to expose Karen once and for all. The meeting was arranged for the following evening. When Nathan stood before the cameras, he laid out the entire story: Karen's illegal fines, her corruption, her manipulation of the HOA board, and most importantly, her attempt to sabotage his life by abusing her power as HOA president. As the news aired, Karen's empire began to crumble. The footage of her attempting to shut off Nathan's utilities spread like wildfire across social media, and the community rallied behind Nathan. Even those who had once quietly accepted Karen's tyrannical rule began to speak out, no longer willing to stay silent. The truth had finally come to light. And Karen? Well, she wasn't happy about being exposed. Her face turned bright red when she saw the news segment, and her fury was palpable. She immediately began calling her allies, trying to salvage what little credibility she had left. But it was too late. The damage had been done. As the community turned against her, Karen's desperation reached new heights. She began showing up at Nathan's door unannounced, demanding that he take down his solar panels or face further consequences. But Nathan had no intention of backing down. He was done playing by her rules. Instead of backing away, Nathan stood his ground, confronting Karen at the next HOA meeting. With a room full of witnesses, he played the footage from the news segment. Everyone saw Karen for who she truly was: a power-hungry, corrupt individual who had abused her position to get what she wanted. The board members, who had once feared Karen's wrath, were now visibly uncomfortable. The atmosphere in the room was tense, and Karen, for the first time, appeared genuinely rattled. "You've crossed a line, Karen," Nathan said, his voice steady. "And now, it's time for the whole neighborhood to see you for what you really are." Karen had no answer. She was outmatched, outmaneuvered, and out of excuses. HOA crumbles and Karen's downfall. The fallout from the news broadcast was swift and unrelenting. Karen's carefully crafted facade began to disintegrate in front of her eyes. The once mighty HOA president, who had made it her personal mission to dictate the lives of the neighborhood, was now exposed as nothing more than a tyrant with a pocketbook full of corruption. The community, which had once silently feared her, rallied behind Nathan, sending a clear message: Karen's reign was over. Nathan could feel the power shift beneath him. The voices of support grew louder with each passing day. Neighbors who had kept quiet about Karen's antics were now speaking out, sharing stories of the unfair fines they'd received, the arbitrary rules they'd been forced to follow, and the countless ways Karen had used the HOA to line her pockets. It was clear that this wasn't just about solar panels anymore. It was about a corrupt system that had been allowed to thrive for far too long. Karen, meanwhile, was in full damage control mode. She began calling in favors, trying to salvage what little she could from the wreckage. But her once loyal supporters were turning on her. The HOA board members who had long been afraid to challenge her began to question her decisions. And it didn't take long for them to realize the full extent of her wrongdoing. Nathan had uncovered a web of illegal activities that Karen had been running for years, and now, no one was willing to cover for her. At the next HOA meeting, Karen walked in, her posture rigid with defiance, but there was no confidence in her step. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, and for the first time in years, she wasn't in control. The board members, once intimidated by her, now sat in judgment. Nathan, standing at the front, had his attorney by his side, ready to present all the evidence of Karen's wrongdoing. The meeting began in a tense silence. Karen tried to speak first, launching into her usual diatribe about the importance of rules and regulations. But the room wasn't listening anymore. One by one, board members started to speak up, voicing their concerns about her leadership and the way she had manipulated the HOA for personal gain. "It's clear to me that we've been misled," one board member said, his voice filled with disgust. "Karen, your actions have harmed this community. You've exploited your position, and it's time for you to step down." The words hit Karen like a slap in the face. She tried to defend herself, but her arguments were weak, her once commanding voice faltering. Nathan stepped forward, his lawyer following closely behind, and presented the damning evidence. Financial discrepancies, forged documents, and the countless fines she had imposed unjustly. But the final blow came when Nathan pulled out the footage of Karen trying to sabotage his solar panels. The room watched in stunned silence as Karen's actions played out on the screen for all to see. Her attempts to have Nathan's utilities shut off, her fraudulent complaints, and her illegal use of power were undeniable. "I'm done with you, Karen," Nathan said, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "This community deserves better than your reign of terror." Karen's face went pale as the board members turned their backs on her. She was finished. The room erupted in murmurs, and several board members quickly moved to vote on her removal. Without any objections, Karen was ousted as president, and the HOA was put into a state of disarray. The members who had once supported her were now scrambling to cover their tracks. But the damage wasn't just limited to Karen's position. The HOA itself was under investigation. The city council, now aware of the corruption that had plagued the organization for years, took swift action. Fines were levied against the HOA for its illegal enforcement of arbitrary rules, and the organization was dissolved. Karen's downfall was swift and unforgiving. Within weeks, she was forced to sell her home to pay off mounting legal fees and fines. Her reputation was in tatters, and she had no choice but to leave the neighborhood she had once ruled with an iron fist. As the for sale sign went up in front of her house, Nathan couldn't help but feel a sense of victory. It wasn't just about the solar panels anymore. It was about standing up for what was right and making sure that no one could abuse power in this way again. The neighborhood, once under Karen's oppressive control, was now free to flourish without fear of overreach. Karen's last act of defiance came when she attempted to address the media one final time, but no one was listening. Her days of manipulating people were over, and all that was left was the wreckage of her failed regime. Nathan, however, had finally achieved what he set out to do: expose Karen's corruption, take back his home, and restore justice to the neighborhood. As the HOA crumbled and Karen faded into the past, Nathan stood tall, knowing he had won the battle not just for himself, but for everyone who had been victimized by her reign of terror. The HOA faces full legal consequences. With Karen gone and the HOA dismantled, the neighborhood began to breathe a collective sigh of relief. But the fallout from the corruption was far from over. The city had launched a full investigation into the HOA's practices, and it didn't take long for the truth to come to light. Nathan's legal team, having gathered all the necessary evidence, filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of the community, accusing the HOA of illegal fines, property damage, and manipulation. They sought not only financial compensation, but also a full investigation into how the HOA had been operating under Karen's leadership for so long without scrutiny. The city had finally woken up to the fact that Karen's petty reign of power was just the tip of the iceberg. As the lawsuit gained traction, Karen's former allies started to turn on her as well. Several board members who had been complicit in the corruption were named in the lawsuit, and soon, the authorities began questioning them. It wasn't just Karen who would face consequences. The entire HOA organization would be held accountable. The HOA itself was officially dissolved, and the city council imposed a hefty fine on the organization for years of illegal enforcement. The neighborhood's collective fight for justice was beginning to bear fruit. The HOA's assets were liquidated to pay for the damages, but Karen, who had taken the most from the community, found herself in a financial nightmare. Nathan, along with a group of determined neighbors, watched as Karen's once imposing fortress of control collapsed. It was a bittersweet victory. No amount of money could undo the damage she had caused, but at least now, the truth was out, and the community could finally begin to rebuild. Karen, now facing the full weight of the law, tried to salvage whatever she could from the wreckage of her life. But no one was listening anymore. She had burned too many bridges, and her name had become synonymous with greed, manipulation, and abuse of power. The once proud leader of the HOA had been reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale. Nathan stood in the middle of it all, his pride in his home and the victory over Karen shining through. The fight had been long, but it had been worth every ounce of effort. In the end, the HOA's downfall wasn't just a personal victory for Nathan. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been victimized by the arbitrary and unfair enforcement of HOA rules. It was proof that standing up for what's right, no matter how difficult the fight, was worth it. As Nathan walked through his neighborhood, the signs of change were everywhere. Neighbors were chatting on front porches again, their yards free from the constant threat of fines. People smiled and waved at each other, and the oppressive atmosphere Karen had cultivated began to fade. But Nathan knew that this victory wasn't just about reclaiming his own property. It was about standing up to corruption, shining a light on those who abused their power, and making sure that the future of the neighborhood would never again be held hostage by someone like Karen. The battle was won, and for the first time in a long time, Nathan felt at peace in the home he had fought so hard to protect. Karen's personal downfall. Karen's personal life fell apart faster than she could have ever anticipated. Her reign of terror was over, and the legal consequences of her actions were just beginning to catch up with her. The community, once terrified of her, had united against her corruption, and now it seemed like everyone was eager to make sure she paid for what she had done. As the lawsuits mounted and the media continued to report on her fall from grace, Karen's once pristine reputation was tarnished beyond repair. Her attempts to clear her name, including desperate phone calls to lawyers and PR firms, were all in vain. No one would touch her case, and even the few remaining allies she had started to distance themselves. The truth about her manipulation and greed had spread like wildfire, and there was no hiding from it now. The final blow came when Karen found herself unable to make the payments for the legal fees that were piling up. With her personal savings drained and her assets frozen due to the ongoing investigation, she was forced to put her house up for sale. It was the only way to cover her mounting debt. The for sale sign hung in front of her once beautiful home like a symbol of everything she had lost. Her new neighbors, however, weren't interested in offering sympathy. They had seen her name in the news, they knew the stories, and they weren't eager to welcome her into their community. Karen's life had become a public spectacle, and the irony wasn't lost on Nathan. The same woman who had once terrorized the neighborhood was now being rejected by it. The final humiliation came when Karen, in a last-ditch effort to salvage some semblance of her dignity, tried to appeal her fines at a city council meeting. She showed up in a suit, trying to put on the appearance of a person who still had control over the situation. But it was clear to everyone that the Karen they once feared was a mere shadow of her former self. As Karen stood at the front of the room, desperately trying to explain her actions, a neighbor who had been wronged by her stood up and said, "You've had your chance, Karen. You've cost us all too much. It's time for you to face the music." The room erupted into applause, and for the first time, Karen's voice was drowned out by the cheers of the community that had once feared her. She left the meeting in a daze, her head spinning with the realization that she had lost everything: her position, her home, her reputation, and any shred of respect she once had. Karen's downfall wasn't just about the loss of her power. It was the public spectacle of watching a woman who thought she was invincible fall apart in the harsh light of truth. For Nathan, the poetic justice was almost too sweet to bear. The woman who had made his life a nightmare was now facing the consequences of her own actions. He had fought for the neighborhood, and in the end, it wasn't just Karen who had lost. It was everything she had tried to build on the backs of the people she had hurt. Karen's personal downfall was a story of greed, corruption, and power gone unchecked. But it was also a story of redemption for the community. Nathan's victory was not just about reclaiming his property. It was about giving everyone who had suffered under Karen's rule the chance to start fresh. As Karen disappeared from the neighborhood, Nathan couldn't help but smile. He had stood up for what was right, and in the end, justice had prevailed. Epilogue and final mic drop. The neighborhood had transformed. Once ruled by fear and petty rules, it now buzzed with a renewed sense of freedom. The lawns were greener, the houses brighter, and for the first time in a long while, neighbors actually spoke to each other, not out of obligation but because they wanted to. The HOA's oppressive reign had come to an end, and in its place stood a community reborn. Nathan sat on his front porch, enjoying the cool evening breeze as he watched kids playing in the street, their laughter echoing down the block. It was hard to believe that just a few months ago, he'd been embroiled in a battle that felt like it would never end. But now, as he watched his neighborhood flourish, he realized the fight had been worth it. It wasn't just about the solar panels anymore, or even about Karen's downfall. It was about standing up for the right to live freely and not to be controlled by the whims of a power-hungry individual. Nathan had fought for the integrity of the community, and in doing so, he had inspired others to do the same. As he sipped his coffee, a neighbor walked by with a smile and a wink. "Hey Nathan," she called. "Just wanted to let you know I found this in my mailbox." She handed him a piece of paper, and he unfolded it with a laugh. It was a fake HOA violation, the kind that Karen used to leave on everyone's door, but now it was a joke. "They really tried," she muttered, sipping her own coffee and joining him on the porch. Nathan grinned, shaking his head. Not anymore. It was a fitting end to a chapter that had caused so much strife. As Karen disappeared from the neighborhood, never to be seen again, the community could finally breathe. The victory wasn't just his, it was everyone's. And as he watched the sun set behind the trees, Nathan knew this was the way it was meant to be. A neighborhood thriving, free from the weight of tyranny. "Guess she learned the hard way," Nathan said, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah," his neighbor replied with a smile. "But it sure is nice living without the constant fear of a fine hanging over our heads." As the final rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Nathan leaned back, the peace he had fought so hard for settling in his bones. The battle was over, and in the end, it wasn't just about winning. It was about making sure that no one, not even someone as powerful as Karen, could ever take away what was rightfully theirs.